Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first edition of TransitScreen Talks. My name is Rachel, and I'm the communications manager here at TransitScreen. We're really excited to bring you this new webinar series covering a huge host of topics. And today, as our first guest, we've got with us Gabe Klein. Gabe, if you want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can actually see me. My name's Gabe, and I've been advising TransitScreen almost since inception.
Yeah.
Is there an echo for folks? I think there might be an echo.
Okay.
And it could be because, there's somebody that's going to tell us. Yes, there's a tad of an echo.
Okay.
Maybe if you mute your mic.
There we go. Yep.
Okay. Better? Yes.
Perfect.
Okay. So anyway, I've been advising TransitScreen now for a number of years and really excited to work with these guys. And actually, we are in their new offices. Say hello, everybody. Say hello. They have been at 1776 for a number of years and just moved over the weekend, I think, into this new space. So they've been really growing. And it's great to see, positive companies that are trying to do good and actually have an impact that cities want and like to be so successful. So in terms of me personally, beyond advising TransitScreen, I advise a number of other startups. I also do venture capital work with Fontenalis Partners based in Detroit. Bill Ford is a co-founder, and we invest in scalable mobility, typically transportation-oriented platforms. And I was formerly the commissioner of the Chicago Department of Transportation, the director of the DC Department of Transportation, where I learned a lot about government, public-private partnerships, the importance of transit and the interconnectivity to land use, and all of that good stuff. And I also have a firm called Cityfy, as if I'm not busy enough, that does urban change management. We work with a lot of cities like Los Angeles, West Palm Beach, Columbus, Ohio, on everything from active transportation, smart cities, sort of typically the interconnectedness of all of these things, and focusing on human transit. I mean, human transit is actually my friend Jared. Human-centered design. And so I think today our plan is to talk a little bit about the changing landscape out there and to concentrate on parking. Because it's going to be so disruptive, particularly to the real estate industry, in a positive way, I think. So I think I'll let you comment, but then I think what I'll do is go over some slides, and that will hopefully stimulate some conversation for everybody.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. So while Gabe gets that ready, just everybody, if you have any questions, during Gabe's presentation, there should be a section for you to ask them. There's a little Q&A, so if you want to go ahead and type those in, we can go ahead and ask them after the slides. And yeah, really excited to hear from you.
Great. Okay, so hopefully we can get me set up as the screen sharer. Actually, do you want me to? Here, I can.
Sorry, bear with us 1 second. So you should be able to, he clicks your screen.
Great. All right, let me put on slideshow. So I've got about 30 slides, and I'll go through it pretty quickly. Let's see, sharing is paused, bring your shared window to front. Can everybody see these slides at this point? Resume share. Okay, great. So let me go back a couple here. So, we've built a lot of parking in cities, and we've built a lot of autocentricity into our cities over the last 65, 75 years. And one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about is, why we've done this and why we need to change it, because we've done it for, we've been on the planet for 200,000 years, but we have, had this detrimental effect on our cities, as of late. And it's really driven by what we think are economics, and we think are, actually, maybe you can monitor the chat.
Yeah, I'm taking a look at it. I think that when you press the
Only
play,
seeing 3/4 of the slide.
yeah, it's just
I
showing
see.
preview.
All right, hold on one second, guys. Desktop.
Yeah, I think let's just try desktop and then do PowerPoint from that.
How's that?
That's much better for me.
Is that better? Okay. So as of late, we have been making some changes in our cities. I worked for Mayor Adrian Fenty and then Mayor Rahm Emanuel between the end of 2008 and the end of 2013. It was really this sort of golden age in cities where there was a lot of sort of pushing back against the auto mentality, as a lot of my generation, Gen X, had moved into cities and decided that we wanted them to look more like they used to look before the cars took over. Now, right now is a very strange time. I'm just going to be honest. And whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, we've got a White House that I think is really neither. And they basically are focusing on undoing a lot of the changes that cities have been working on for a number of years. There's a lot of talk of state preemption, of undoing regulations that we know are good for the environment, and a lot of the little pushes that we've been giving to our populations in cities to get them to do the right things. So let's just look back. We're sitting here in Washington, D.C. This is a few blocks from where we are. And I just think it's important to look back and see what cities used to look like. There weren't crosswalks because people crossed wherever they wanted to. This is early 1900s. There were, a few cars in the system, but it was more of a balanced transportation system where people used streetcars to get between neighborhoods. They used bikes, and they used cars when they needed to, but it was not the primary mode of transport. And I think most of us know our history and know that, in the name of technology and progress, we decided to build massive highways to connect our cities, while our friends in Europe were building rail systems. And that was obviously the beginning of what became a pretty massive change for our cities, as the freeways started to come through the cities, which tore out entire neighborhoods. And then we moved the people to the suburbs. So, this is not necessarily that complex. It's a pretty simple story. We left people's jobs downtown in the name of economic progress and technology progress. We moved people out to the suburbs, thinking that everybody would want to have their own space, and we sprawled basically. And it's created a lot of different types of problems. When it comes to parking, I think the history is fascinating. There's a woman named Michelle Richmond, and you can read her piece on parking when it meant space for trees. But it's fascinating that we used to have parking on Pennsylvania Avenue here in DC, all over the city, and it referred to park space. It referred to places to plant trees. Most of our grand boulevards had plantings. And actually Congress in, I think 1872, passed a law that you should dedicate up to 50% of space on streets to park space. And that quickly changed when people started parking their horses and then their cars in between the trees. And what basically happened is we removed the trees and we left the cars. And that's what we have today. And most people don't know that. And so, then there was a big impact in terms of industry really selling us the idea of parking and garages for our cars that we were buying. And we really had this period of social re-engineering around machines, thinking that it was our key to freedom. But was it our key to freedom? I would argue we've become a slave to it. And, people feel sort of stuck. They feel stuck in the suburbs. Sometimes it's due to affordability or what they feel are better schools. and then they have to get to their job. And so we've got somewhere between 500 million and 2 billion parking spaces in the US. In fact, we don't actually know how many spaces we have, which tells you the size of the problem. And this is sort of what we're left with. People spending sometimes hours of their day getting to and from work, the destruction of public space, the devaluation of private real estate adjacent to these freeways, and a bunch of pollution. So, let's talk about cities. Let's talk about transit. We tend to think of transit as this thing that moves a lot of people, which is important. But actually, in many ways, it's more about creating great places where people can live and work, because everything that they need is right there. And when they have to move, like here in DC, we have Metro. I actually don't take Metro that much because I usually walk and bike. I take the bus. Sometimes I take the rail, but I located my home next to the rail so that if I had to go somewhere, I could. And because I knew all the grocery stores were there, and the doctor's office, and the bars, and the restaurants. And so that's important to remember. So I was the vice president at Zipcar back in the early days for 4 years. And this is one of the first real technology-enabled transportation as a service companies. And now there's many, many more. I mean, there's hundreds that I know of personally. But when we partnered with cities for parking, and we were given parking on the street, it was a really important shift for us. It was a real public-private partnership, but it also showed that public space could be used for more than just people parking their own personal cars. And if 21 people or up to 21 people could share a Zipcar, there was a public good there, and the city was willing to give us that space. And that also is what ultimately, led us in many ways to become more well-known, more profitable, to go public, and all of those things. And so now, there's no hotter sector in investing or anything else besides transportation as a service. And the government's getting in on it too. This is a picture of the STA system in Montreal, where they really are starting to curate your entire trip from door to door, so that people don't need to have a car. They don't need to have a parking space, because with one app, they can know sort of where they are, what the adjacent amenities are, and also get discounts while they're riding on the system or they're on the bike share. And it's really also important to start thinking about private services as well as public services. And when we think about, having a car, having a parking space, I mean, just the car payment alone is taking up more than 10% of household income in every city but where I'm sitting right now. And I would like to think it's because we put so many public and private amenities in place and services that people have a plethora of options. But I'm working in Atlanta, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute, where they're at 15%. Or you go down to Tampa, Miami, Detroit, over 18% of people's income just to the payment. So why is all this important? I mean, obviously there's the cost component, making cities less affordable and so forth, but also climate change. We're working in Charleston, South Carolina, where the cities had to actually buy up land that's being condemned, buy up apartment buildings. They're looking at about 70 days, by 2050, 180 days of nuisance flooding, where, over 70 days, and you aren't supposed to live there. So this is a really serious issue. And it matters because transportation is the #1 source of pollution as of this year. So for the first time since 1980, we're seeing more pollution from transport than buildings or power plants and so on and so forth, which is sort of good and bad news. We're getting a better handle on that. We're burning less coal, although the Trump administration would like to undo that. What's nice, though, is that once the market gets to a certain point, like there's more money now flowing into renewables than fossil fuels, it's very hard to undo that progress. We also know now that induced demand is a real thing. So there are a lot of conversations happening finally over the last, I feel like it's been the last year or two about, maybe we don't want to build more road capacity because maybe that's the problem. Maybe building more parking and more road capacity is leading to people driving more versus people are driving more, so we got to add more capacity, which is the conventional wisdom, then we build all the parking at either end of the trip. So let's look at DC as an example. By the way, this is 2014. This is, in technology terms, quite a few years ago, but 88% of new DC households are car free. They're not bringing a car or buying a car when they move here. So when people say, hey, when the autonomous vehicles come, we could see 95% of people, not driving. I'm like, yeah, because, in cities that have great transit and great private options as well, we're already seeing that. And so in Europe, which is a little bit ahead of us because they didn't really lose their transit heritage, you already see some really creative thinking. Superblocks is one of my favorite concepts right now, where they'd like to cut 60% of traffic out, which means a lot less parking as well. And what they're doing is a two-phase system where they get rid of all right turns in neighborhoods, right? So they're taking this, 3x3 neighborhoods, and they are saying you can only make right turns. Then phase 2 is to actually get rid of through traffic in neighborhoods. So they're basically asking people to be dropped off and picked up, and to walk up to a block and a half. And if you can't do that, then we have larger problems, unless you have a disability, which is a different story. I just pulled this off the internet in the last couple of days. I actually tweeted out this morning. I think this is fascinating. You're seeing this all over Europe. Basically, mayors are competing to get rid of parking and to ban cars because they're seeing the economic impacts. They know we got to hit the Paris climate numbers, or we're going to be in deep doo-doo. And the reality is we're going to pay on the back end 10x if we don't deal with the problem on the front end versus just dealing with the symptoms of the symptoms. And fundamentally, once people taste this is what they want. We're also realizing that the street is a little more sophisticated. I look at old pictures of DC, and you see wooden platforms in the late 1800s, early 1900s in the streets where people got on these streetcars. You see much more space devoted to plantings. And so in many ways, we're going back to that, in a more sophisticated way. This is courtesy of NACTO. But every street should be a complete street. And that is becoming a mantra all over the world. And that means less space, devoted to parking. Now, compounding this move, and the reason why real estate execs and others are really interested in this, and we're working on a number of projects around the country, working in Atlanta, here in DC, with some major developers on what the future is going to look like. Because if you don't need to build parking, because not only all these fundamental design changes are happening, but there's technology coming that will alleviate the need for people to own cars. They have a real interest in that can save them a lot of money. And so, people are thinking that layering on autonomous vehicles will basically get rid of the need for people to own vehicles in an urban context. Obviously, when you're, and by the way, this article is over 5 years old. But when you look in a suburban context or a rural context, it will be different. How much different depends a little bit on the level of density. But we know that by 2050, the majority of people will live in cities. Actually, 70% of people will live in cities. So I was working in Atlanta. Actually, I was presenting to the mayor a couple weeks ago, and I took a picture outside of my window, and I was looking at all the parking. This is at 6 a.m. I was like, wow, just right in front of me, I'm seeing 5 parking garages. So this is structured parking, entire buildings devoted to parking. That does not include the surface lots, which are everywhere. If you look in the bottom right corner, there are surface lots down there. So you have up to 25-30% of cities between on-street and off-street devoted to parking. And so people ask me all the time when I'm working in the city, well, how does that actually impact us? Because look, politicians in particular, but everybody, they want to know how it actually impacts people's lives. And so what's interesting is the average 2-bedroom in the US is $800, right? Once you layer on structured underground parking, which is the most expensive, you go up to $1,300. That's a 62.5% increase in somebody's cost of living, coupling housing and transportation. That's a huge increase. Never mind the fact that when you make that kind of investment in parking, then probably you're not making as much investment as you should in transit, right? And so then people feel like, well, I need to go out and buy a car. And in, AAA estimates in an urban environment, it's, it fluctuates, but it's between $850 and $900 to keep a car in a city. And so you go from, if they had that $800 apartment and they used shared mobility and transit and walked and biked, about $950,000 in total cost, up to $2,300 in cost. So that's making cities unaffordable. That's just adding to the social ills that we have in our city. And when you look at just at the 500 million parking space number, with 0.05% of our current parking, which is nothing, we could house all of our people. And many of you guys on this webinar know that micro units are all the rage. Big developers are building. There's 4 of them going on right now in DC. And obviously, if a unit is 350 square feet and a parking space is 330 square feet, it makes very little sense to build a unit and a parking space of the same size, unless we want to incent people to drive. And so, people are now saying, well, what could we do with parking? Could we repurpose it? Absolutely. Some people are asking, could we repurpose it in its current form, but with some level of technology and design to reuse it more quickly than having to tear down a building? And new buildings are going up with the ramps set up externally so they can be cut off. Or there are other design features like pre-plumbing it, running the HVAC so that it can be converted in 10 years to something else at much lower cost. So this is really exciting, particularly if you care about affordability. Sorry, that's a little dim, but what it shows you is that parking is subsidized because we think people want it. They don't necessarily, and we could actually be giving people, those homeless people, we could be giving them a place to live for $358 a month at current interest rates if we focused and prioritized people storage versus car storage. Oh, there it is, less dim. And there's more money. So, I wrote this book, Startup City, about these topics because there's more money to be made in doing good than just doing things the old way, which is also leading to a worse environment and so on and so forth. And I just saw this last week. Garage parking is 16% on average of rent, which is fascinating. And the fact is the majority of people in cities don't want the parking space. So we're in this sort of vicious cycle where the finance people think that the developer needs to build the parking. The developer thinks he needs to build the parking because the city has parking minimums. The city has parking minimums because they're doing something they did 20 years ago. And the public, on average, thinks that we need the parking or that their neighborhood will be flooded with cars. But it's all false. Induced demand says quite the opposite. So anyway, we need to change this, and we need to go back to something tried and true, which has always worked, which is high capacity, high quality transit. Now, if that transit ends up being fleets of autonomous, connected 12-person shuttles mixed with 180 passenger streetcars, I don't know how all that's going to shake out. But fundamentally, we need to devote space to high capacity vehicles that move lots of people. And then we need some flexibility as well, particularly for local connectivity into people's neighborhoods. And it's fascinating to look at, what people are thinking about in terms of repurposing parking spaces or dead space. What's funny about these two examples is they actually are like bolting on something to a parking garage. I was in Indy, and they built micro units and they bolted them on. So they actually took a travel lane, which is great, and bolted on micro units to this massive parking garage. But I'm hoping in the future you start to see the political will and capital to just get rid of the parking altogether. And I think the private sector is key to this because it's not the highest and best use, but there's also a lot more money to be made if we do things differently. And once we realize that, particularly for younger people, but also empty nesters, ownership is really just not that important for transportation or for a lot of things. As long as people have a phone, they feel connected. So that's my opening salvo. And with that, I think we can have a discussion.
Yeah, I think we want to zoom out. We can both be on the same screen. Okay. Yeah, Gabe, thank you so much. I think that was a really great overview kind of touched on everything. We do have a couple of questions from the audience, and I had a couple prepared as well. There we go. We got you in there.
All right.
So the first question is, how much public resistance do you think we'll see when first bringing up the idea of decreasing parking? I know that a parking space or two is usually a selling feature for people looking to rent or buy, even if they don't have a car.
So let me give an example of what we're talking about in West Palm Beach. And we're working there with the city on a mobility plan, along with some other great consulting firms with Alta, Sam Schwartz, and some local traffic engineers as well. So we started talking about micro units, and they have their first micro units actually coming in. That they have a developer who's going to do like 300 to 400 square foot units. And this is an opportunity to write new code because they don't have micro unit code because it's new. And so what if we wrote the code in such a way that we not only didn't require parking, we had a parking maximum, and we said, hey, we're going to at maximum allow, 0.25 parking spaces per, or honestly, you could do 0. Because here's the thing, when you start to look at shared parking in a district, and when I say a district, I mean like a number of neighborhoods, let's say 5 or 10 minutes walk, you start to realize that the utilization of the office parking is during the day, the residential parking is at night. And so, look at all these business models that have taken off in the last few years. Zipcar being one, where if everybody's sharing a car, it can be used about 50, 60% of the time, versus a car on average is not used. It sits 95% of the time. And so parking shouldn't be any different. And so we're talking about how do we utilize every space we have day and night? How do we get the developer to build less and save that person a ton of money? And when we save them a ton of money, that person that's spending, let's say, $100 million to build that development, and we save them $8 million in this case, I think, the interest on that $8 million would pay for everybody that lives there to have $150 a month in mobility. Then in the back end, we can negotiate with Brightline, with Zipcar, with Lyft, with whoever to get $150 worth of credit at a discounted fee on that mobility wallet. And so basically what we're talking about is reversing the carrots and sticks. So instead of saying, hey, you get this, small unit, a 1-bedroom or micro unit, and we're giving you a parking space. Oh, and by the way, don't drive, tisk, tisk, tisk. We're saying, why don't you save them a few $100s a month, even by providing them the mobility net, it's still less than if you had to build a parking space, right? Yeah. So they save money, you incent them to do the things you want, and then you give them the option to get a parking space if they want it. In the municipal garage, on the same block, in another garage that's an office building, but is empty at night. And they can buy into that. So again, we're reversing the carrots and sticks. So we're saying, we're giving you mobility, you can buy parking if you want to. And that incentive switch can have a huge impact in the decisions people make in terms of purchasing transportation. And then from there, it waterfalls down into their behavior.
Yeah, I think that reminds me especially of in terms of like employers doing parking buyouts instead of just offering, subsidized transit. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. Lots of questions. Thank you, everybody. The question from Brian, kind of on a related note, I think, is where's the middle ground for a suburban community? All these bold plans are great, but that often isn't currently the reality in more conservative or bedroom-oriented communities.
Yep. So this is a really tough one to answer. I mean, I think, because to a certain extent, I think it's a bit of a red herring. I think the suburbs can do the same thing. And I look at like Phoenix, right? I look at, the fact that they built this one initial light rail line, and Phoenix is not dense. It's been so successful that they're taxing themselves. They passed a referendum for $31.2 billion to build a citywide light rail. And they're seeing explosive growth and investment around the light rail. So, or Arlington right here.
Yeah.
When I moved to DC, 20 some years ago, I'm dating myself. It was like a bunch of empty lots with a couple high rises that they were putting metro in. And now it's like a national TOD example. You see the same thing happening in Gaithersburg, Tyson's Corner,
Reston,
Reston. I mean, all over. And so I think the trend's going to be the successful suburbs are going to reinvent themselves as urban villages. And big picture, like not everybody wants to live, like I don't want to live in New York.
Right.
I love visiting, but I like the scale of DC. Like I was born in a small, like a rural area, then lived in Charlottesville. I'm just very comfortable in a place like DC. There are places like Montclair, New Jersey. There are places like Aspen, like Berkeley. There are places that have 6,000 people that have all of the basic amenities that you need. Mayor Scadrone in Aspen has started the service called the Downtowner, and it's great. It's a free electric shuttle service. And then what he's done is he's pushed people to the edges of the downtown to park. He basically is taking out all the parking in the downtown. And this is a town of 6,000 people. Now, obviously, it swells a lot with tourism, but now if you live in a place that's like totally sprawling, car-oriented, lots of surface lots, I understand it's frustrating and it feels like there's no way out. But I think that when things get bad enough, combined with the fact that you start to see regionally some great TOD examples, people will hit rock bottom and say we need to change. That's what happened here in Tyson's Corner, which I would say was probably one of the worst places in the United States. Like you had to, I worked out there in like the late 90s. You had to drive across the street to get a sandwich. You couldn't walk across Route 7. You'd get killed.
Yeah.
And now they're making it more transit-oriented, walkable. They aren't even putting in kiss and ride lots at the metro station. So anyway, I think there are lots of opportunities. Don't be discouraged. And you got to have some small victories, but then also sometimes things have to get so bad that you hit rock bottom like Tyson's did. And they said, look, we either change or we die.
Yeah.
And they made big investments.
And they did change.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also related, Sheila wants to know if you have any suggestions on how to get the public or cities on board without reducing or getting rid of the parking minimums. Our county's looking to reduce them, but it's meeting resistance.
Along the TOD corridor. Well, I'd love to hear more about this because it depends a little bit on what you're building, what some of the trade-offs are. But I would say you can reduce, like, let's say some people say one per bedroom, right? So just going to one parking space per unit is a big improvement. Like if you can cut it in half. And I would also collect data on what's actually being utilized now. Because you might be surprised how many people don't want parking now. I think also getting them to understand the concept of induced demand, and there's good data on that. Like the study I put up on a slide is from 2001. I think somebody named Littman did it. But whether it's the Embarcadero that fell down in San Francisco, and there's so many examples of parking and lanes leading to congestion. And sometimes you have to have the outside expert come in and say the things you can't say. And honestly, that's what I do a lot.
Yeah.
But feel free to message these guys afterwards too, and I can try to give you some more concrete examples and maybe you could tell me a little bit more.
Awesome. Daniel would like to know what effect you're seeing that Uber and Lyft are having on parking demand in cities. Will we need to see more curbside space reserved for pickup drop-off?
Yes.
Definitely.
That's an awesome question. When I ran the DOT here in DC, 2010 or so, Karina Ricks and I and Alice Kelly, who ran public space, we worked on how to give how to right size the space, not only for taxis at the time, but for FedEx and UPS. Now you got, Amazon. You have so many people that are picking up and dropping off as services become more prevalent. What we did though is we looked at side streets for taxi stands so that we weren't blocking traffic on major thoroughfares. I'm not saying that's what we should do now. All I'm saying is that we can decide where we want pick up and drop off to be. The more that we do bump outs, the more that you sort of have these perfect spots to pick people up and drop them off. They can mess with bike lanes though. So you have to strike a balance between where you want your bike lanes. I mean, this is why design is so important. The NACTO design guides, and I'm on the advisory board there. are so great. And they have a transit guide, the global streets guide, the urban design guidelines, which have been endorsed by everybody from the state of California to ULI. So I would check those out. And then there's some good work that's been done in DC, New York City, and other places on this specific issue. But absolutely, with Uber and Lyft coming and being so impactful, yes, we're going to have to redesign pickup and drop off. And with autonomous vehicles, it'll even become more so.
Yeah. All right, Mike. Oh yeah.
And one last thing, we can charge for that space.
Yeah.
So one of the things we did in DC is we doubled the sizes of most of our loading zones, and then we started charging for it.
Nice. Well, one of the things I also think is interesting is with Lyft Line or Uber Pool or Via, I use Via, a lot is setting up pickup drop-off spaces that are always there and always the same. They have you go walk a little bit to that corner instead of picking every single person up individually at like less convenient places.
Right, and Via's done a great job with that, and you see Uber and Lyft now pushing people.
Yeah.
Like I was coming out of the ballpark, I was jumping in a Lyft and it said, this is the Lyft pickup spot.
Right.
So it becomes more like a transit stop, which is very interesting when you start to think about TOD and how these services could contribute versus hurt TOD.
Awesome. Mike would like to know if you have any insight on electric vehicle parking demand trends, especially in multifamily or in general.
That's a great question. I'm actually getting ready to start working a little bit on an EV project, and we've done some work in Columbus with the Smart City Challenge on this topic. I don't have any particular factoids for you, but I can tell you that, just based on the demand for the Model 3 alone, I think they've got 500,000 deposits. It's going to greatly increase. Like I know Tesla is actually pretty frazzled about how they're going to roll out enough, of their high-speed charging stations. And then in terms of people charging at home, the great thing is if you're parking there at night, you can use a standard plug, or you can take two plugs and make it like a 240 from two 110s or 120s. So, it doesn't need to be that sophisticated, but I think you're going to see a lot of demand, and also for solar, which is a wonderful thing. Like I just put solar on my house, and it's contributing about 40% of my need. So if I did have an electric car, which I may at some point, then that would, I would be charging with solar.
Right there, yeah.
Not coal.
Awesome. Jason would like to know, what incentives are cities giving developers to design and build differently? How will new mobility routes be financed, operated, and maintained if the money is being saved and access provided more equitably? Who covers the costs?
Great question.
Yeah.
These are all things that are being talked about in various levels of detail. We just had a summit in Pittsburgh with Mayor Peduto and the American Architecture Foundation on all these new technologies coming, how it's going to shake out. And one of the things we talked about more than anything is how the dollars and cents were going to shake out. Now, in terms of incentives, I would say that overall, I've been pretty disappointed in the incentives that cities are giving. They've really had a hard time even going away from parking minimums.
Yeah.
Right. It's just been really tough. And I think it's because there's a misunderstanding by the public in terms of how this works, induced demand, and they put pressure on the politicians, and then the politicians don't change anything. We had that problem here in DC, and we're a pretty progressive place. But in terms of new mobility routes being financed, one of the things that's important for these companies that are putting together these business models and plans is that they be as infrastructure light as possible, and that they don't tax the system, and that they don't need a lot of new implementations of anything beyond like striping and some sign upgrades. But if they do rely on those things, they're going to have to pay for it. I don't see any other way, as cities are pretty strapped right now. Now, as cities become more successful, as they may become partners in these services, like for instance with Zipcar, we got those spaces for free when we were a tiny little startup, and now they're like $3,500 a year. So, and that goes right into the city coffers. Also in my book, I talk about how I think we could see some new business models structured around cities continuing to take an ongoing stake, whether it be in a service or in real estate that gets repurposed into something else besides parking. Like, why should the city just give it away for $1 and walk away, right? I do think, though, that when a company is very small and young, it can be super helpful to incent them to do their work. Like people were saying back in the Zipcar days, well, why doesn't the city just start their own Zipcar? I was like, can you imagine how bad that would have been? Plus, you would have had a membership that worked here and nowhere else.
Yeah.
Like one of the things that's great about Uber and Lyft and now Via is that you just get off the plane, you can use it somewhere. That's it. So anyway, this is a much longer discussion. We could do another webinar on this. Yeah. But I think it's going to be pretty fascinating. I think cities are going to push for completely new business models here.
All right.
Or at least I will.
What are your opinions on Musk's underground highway?
Yeah. So, I mean, look.
And do you think that's encouraging car ownership, I guess?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, look, Elon is so smart. Just because he's pushing this idea of like vehicles going into a hyperloop, that doesn't mean they're owned by people.
Right.
But I will admit that, whether it's, Sergey Brin or Elon or many of these other guys from Silicon Valley, I do find that they have a bit of a suburban mentality because they live in the suburbs.
I mean, I was going to say, yeah, if you look at it, yeah.
That's why it's so important for those guys to get out and talk to, I mean, it's a way like the GOP talks about getting out and talking to regular people, but getting out of Silicon Valley and talking to regular people in regular cities, because like I always say, Elon's Model X, really impressive feat of engineering, but it's 6,800 pounds. If that hits my kid, she's injured or so. I think we need those guys to think about context sensitive solutions, and also like tunneling underground is extremely expensive, and I know they're really fixated on trying to figure out how to do it more inexpensively.
Yeah,
but that's going to be a long road to hoe. No pun intended.
Awesome. And this looks like the last question, and we're just about out of time. And I think this is a great one to end on. Cities like LA or Tampa seem so far from other more transit-centric places like NYC, DC, Arlington. What's a good first step toward change in a massive city?
So I've been doing some work in Tampa over the last few years, and LA. And we're actually working in LA on the implementation of the Urban Mobility and Digital Age Plan with LA DOT. And Salita Reynolds, some of you may know, is the GM there. And like what she and Mayor Garcetti are doing, I think is great. Like they realize it's a huge city, but it's a huge city of neighborhoods, of smaller cities. And so I see them making efforts, macro level on big transit investments, which started with Via Ragosa, who passed the 30 and 10 plan. 30 years worth of transit in 10 years, and they have hundreds of millions of dollars going into it. And actually, Mayor Garcetti just tweeted the other day the picture of what the new metro system is going to look like. So I actually think LA is a great example of working at the macro level on the big investments, and then the smaller investments, increasing the dash bus coverage, putting in bike lanes, having 3 different bike share systems, which may not be a good thing, but there are real efforts going. I just read this morning they're looking for state money to expand the bike share in LA. So California is a little bit unique, and LA and San Francisco, because they actually have a governor who understands cities. He was the mayor of Oakland. Basically, when you have a set of state leaders that get along with the city leaders and they can see eye to eye, it's so different. In Florida, unfortunately, the governor is just not that sophisticated. And like in Tampa, they've been trying to expand the Tampa Bay Expressway for years, and it's really just a stimulus program to pay back the construction industry, the road builders, and it's extremely detrimental to the public and to real estate. But you know what? I'm proud that I've been pushing back on it for 2 years along with local advocates, and I don't think it's going to happen. I think there's been a grassroots groundswell of local support combined with real estate business support, and they've come together and said, we don't want this, and I think the governor's backing down. So sometimes it's fending off negative projects like that, and sometimes it's the big projects and the little projects like in LA. But Tampa will get there, as places like Miami and West Palm Beach set the tone, they can follow along.
Awesome. Well, I think that's about all the time we have.
We're actually over time.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for all the questions, and thank you, Gabe, for being with us.
Absolutely.
If anybody has any feedback after, you can definitely send us an email, press@transitscreen.com, tweet at us, anything. But thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for having me,
Good talk.
guys. Great to talk to you.